Starting right now, it feels a little strange to engage in today's video. I'd missed yesterday's. In some sense, this is yesterday's. I've now lost track. I think I'm 3 or 4 days I've missed in this series so far. Yesterday, I kept falling asleep. Starting to get some hint as to why. I keep looking over at the notes that I made for this one. This work that I've been doing about showing up and trying to speak directly from what is within. Speak directly from essence, quote-unquote essence. One thing that's really stood out in my experience, it's a little funny. So recently I read Michael Singer's book, The Untethered Soul. There's a clear example he gives in the very beginning in chapter 1 or 2, having to do with this thing that I've playfully titled for this one, post-narration. He pointed this out. I've observed this phenomenon, but he really compressed it and explicated it really clearly. This business of how, I remember as a kid, I was really confused about the fact that I could decide I want to go outside and play. I want to grab one of my play swords, like one of my plastic swords, and go beat up bad guys in the backyard. Imaginary bad guys. And I would imagine this would come to mind. And then I would think the thought. I was really confused about this. And what I mean by that is that before images or words would come to mind, I would already know what I was about to think. And this is especially clear with the words. Like I would get this thing of, I want to go out into the backyard and swing my sword around and beat up like I was really into Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, so I was like fighting alongside Leonardo against all the Foot Clan, and so this sense of it and the clarity of what I meant would come to mind, and then I would watch the words play out in my head, kind of a mix of visual and audio, but predominantly audio. I would hear the words, I want to go outside and play fighting against the Foot Clan or whatever. I would watch the words form. I would play with, wait, what if I stop the words? I would make my mind pause. I wasn't able to make the whole effort go away. I wasn't even thinking about that. And there was just, wait, what is this? And I would pause. And I would notice I still knew what the end of the sentence was before the sentence had been said. I always thought that was odd. I would play with that from time to time, and then I forgot for 30 years. So Michael Singer is pointing this out about looking up at the sky and thinking, wow, that sky is so beautiful. But to think that thought, I have to already know that the sky is beautiful. What's the commentary for? This morning, I checked my phone app to see, oh, can I go see the sunrise? And when I pulled it open, it showed, no, it's going to be raining all morning. And then the words came, oh, it's raining. I'm not going to be able to watch the sunrise. So this has been baking my noodle. I, in some sense, feel like I'm actually looking at this process. I'm examining it and going, wait, what's going on here? My mind knows the answer in some sense. I've got this model, but I'm not asking my mind. I'm trying to go down into experience. Wait, what's going on here? When I say going down into experience, I'm referring to a previous video. This distinction between asking my mind, asking my thoughts, what I think about something, versus looking at the lived experience. How do I feel my feet? Oh, here's the theory of neurons versus experiencing my feet and looking at how I do that. So, yesterday, while sitting with this, well, sitting in a manner of speaking, being present to this experience, I started re-listening to Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth. He narrates his own book, and he's he strikes me as something like everyone's favorite enlightened grandpa. It's very pleasant to listen to, and very grounding. He's very clear about a very particular way of orienting to consciousness. I don't listen to him for ideas. I listen to him for more the resonance, the way in which being with people with open hearts helps the heart to open. It's not about ideas. It's not about information. It's about a kind of exposure. I wanted re-exposure to how he feels and how he orients. I noticed this same thing happening. He's talking about the ego and the way the ego comes up with all of these stories, and he tries to define the ego. Well, it's one of these things where the definition only makes sense after you already know what he's talking about. So, oh, okay. I feel like I have a much clearer picture of what he means by ego. And I could just as well say this, oh, this talking thing is the ego, but that's actually tautological. It doesn't provide any new information. I noticed while I was walking this thing that's been itching at me for a while, that what is it like to live without compulsive thinking? To sort of not only just not believe the thoughts, but for the thoughts to actually be silent. I've had glimpses of this. Sometimes I've had extended periods. It's been very pleasant. And then my mind will boot back up, and I'll notice that there are things that my mind does that I really like it doing. So I'll often experience this argument going through my mind of, this spiritual stuff of get beyond the mind. The mind is dukkha. I forget which which enlightened teacher said that particular one. The mind is dukkha. Might have been Krishnamurti. But I've long had a sense of disdain for that kind of perspective. Like, yeah, I'm sure this is helpful. There's something about, and I have a full analysis of this. I have a full model of what's going on with that perspective, why that keeps coming up. The mind makes suffering possible. So if you turn off the mind, then suffering vanishes. That's okay, great. But that doesn't, like, that's like going back to being an animal rather than going forward into being something that harnesses the power of being human. And so I've long felt this resistance to this perspective, and I still feel like there's something. Let me set that aside. That isn't the thing I want to say there. And on this walk yesterday, I was with this slowing down of the whole process, doing the same movement, not just with that I was doing as a kid, not just with the words, but with the entire conceptual structure, watching the conceptual structure emerge and noticing before it emerges, I already know what the thought is. I know what the thought is. I could see my mind trying to build a conceptual structure around that fact, trying to go meta, going, oh, look at this, I'm able to observe it. What does that structure mean? And I noticed, in the same way that I could see what the end of the thought was, I could see what the question being asked was. And it wasn't me asking the question, it was my mind. I recognized that there's some sort of flavor where I'd been kind of tricked. I'd tricked myself. Like I'd written a program whose job it was to fool me, and here I was watching it fool me. So watching it describe why, in some sense, this post-narration is really important. I wasn't thinking of it as post-narration, but I think it's basically the same thing as this process of I experience, and then my mind comes in and narrates the experience. Why is that important? Well, it's important to the mind, because if the mind doesn't do that, it can't grasp what I'm doing. It can't do its work. And in particular, for whatever reason, it can't keep me, like I don't know why it wants to, but it can't do its job that I'm pretty sure I gave it at some point, of keeping me one step removed from my experience. Able to navigate in this well-defined, safe world of the mental model of reality. And that when I set that aside and I'm just in contact, it's fine. It's absolutely fine. It's beautiful. I mean, this is where beauty is. Like when I'm worrying about what my audience might be thinking, I don't notice how, like on this camera, right next to the camera, there's this little green dot. I actually don't know why. I have a guess about why that's there. That's probably the designers, if I'm using a Mac here, a MacBook Air. And the Air has this design for, I guess if I look at the light, it looks a lot like I'm looking at the camera. And it also gives me a signal that the camera is on. Like, okay, that's interesting design. But those are thoughts. What's present, if I'm with my experience, is that there's actually something really neat about the color. I don't notice the color at all most of the time. It's just part of my environment. It gets filtered out. But there is a kind of beauty to it. It's not my favorite green. There's a kind of sense of, it would be even better if it were a kind of a darker, more emerald color. And part of what's going on there is my mind bringing in a comparison. But that's after the experience. That's kind of a mental post-production. It's a thing that my mind does to the experience to modify it and then add contrast so that I can add judgment. Before I do any of that, there is a direct contact with the experience. And that direct contact isn't something my mind can ever actually hold. The best it can do is this sort of mental pointer. I've got this verbalization. The verbalization points at the experience, but it can't actually capture the experience. I guess in some sense this is the hard problem of consciousness. Is it possible to capture all of experience in language? By which we mean something like computer language. But it's a logical structure and it boops around. But that is the question we're asking. How do we capture it all in language? And there is a lived obviousness of, no, you can't. That isn't. Language is at the wrong order of reality. Not meaning to dismiss the efforts to examine consciousness in terms of computer science. I think that's beautiful too. I don't mean to dismiss that at all. But I'm getting a little afield. Let me recenter here. So one of the things this has been doing for me, just watching more and more carefully. What is this post-narration doing? Not examining it and trying to analyze it. That's putting it into the mind. Like it's very clear to me what this process is as I've been watching it. It's not very complicated at all. It's sort of like when I'm trying to think of a good example of this. There's a type of thing where you can use a computer camera in order to examine a 3D object. And in examining the 3D object, the camera takes it in and creates a 3D model. Like actually, they did this with my teeth a few days ago. I have this fascinating model that is my teeth. It is so curious to be able to hold my teeth and I can see it. And when I run my fingers across it, there's a way where it actually feels like running my fingers across my teeth. And it is so fascinating to feel the kind of embodied affection that I have for this shape. It's so fascinating. But the thing is that the computer doesn't take in the object. The computer scans the surface and then creates this digital representation of the surface. That's what they were doing with my teeth. They were shining this light on the teeth, and it would show this 3D model, complete with the coloration. It was really fascinating to watch. They would get all of these little bits of like each of the individual like little grooves. Like my teeth actually have slight lines in them on the enamel. And I could see the lines, and that was part of how I recognized it. Like, yeah, I'm familiar with those little grooves. Those are my grooves. I've looked at them for a long time in the mirror. I can feel them with my tongue, and yes, that's it. So, yeah, so there's this this process where the computer the computer can't take in the object. That wouldn't mean anything. You shove the object into the camera, wham! Like that's, what's that gonna do, right? But if there's a software interface that allows the computer to come up with a representation of the object, then it is possible for the computer to interact with its representation of the object. In fact, that's all it can actually interface with. Before it does that, it has no concept of the object. There's a perception of a thing. Maybe it can see edges. That's the beginning of its understanding of the object. But it's examining the world to see, how do I translate this into my terms? That post-narration is exactly the same thing. It's really clearly the same thing. The thing I keep calling the mind is a computer. And when I say mind, I'm describing this level of experience. I'm describing the computer. Depending on how firmly in the materialist paradigm you want to be, technically mind includes the parts that involve the thing before the post-narration as well, the part where my eyes take in the light and there's this kind of processing in the visual cortex that comes up with a representation of the object, which I imagine as being out here. There's a problem with circularity with that logic because, well, how do you know about the things that you're observing in the world such that the eyes are taking them in? Because you read some studies with these eyes that come up with the representation, because you examined the optics and you learned how the math works using this experience that is taking in this information and representing it. So where is the contact with reality? how do you know that any of this idea that you're holding about how you experience the world has anything to do with the world, as opposed to just being an idea? The mind, by which I mean this computer I'm trying to point at, has a really hard time with self-reference. So when it encounters self-reference loops, it tends to blip and then ignore. It tends to skip, or it tends to simplify, or it will tend to try to replace it with recursion. This, I found it immensely helpful to give my mind this understanding, this clear distinction between recursion and self-reference, and to give lots and lots of examples of how self-reference actually looks and why self-reference is a sign that it's outside the domain of the mind. That isn't what this is about. That isn't what I want to talk about here in too much detail. I just want to gesture towards there's something I feel a lot of pride about there, and that I feel is tremendously important in terms of converting the mind into something that actively supports being awake and being kind and being sane. But let me set that aside. This representation process, I can observe it as, this is a cup. I'm like, oh, yeah, like, I knew that before the post-narration happened, so what's the narration for? Well, there are a couple of purposes. One is, this is a cup. The cup is blue. I like the smoothness of the surface. Like this is part of the conversion process, and the representation is in part checking back with me. Is this right? If I say, this cup is red, I look at it and go, bullshit, what was that thought? Mind can get the feedback going, oh, I mean, it's blue. Oh, okay, that's better. So it's like getting some kind of check going back. But a check against what? A check against the truth that I know before the mind does any of this representation. A second purpose for me is this way that, like, there's this extra odd pressure argument that happens. As I watch it, I suspect that I'm doing this to myself rather than this being something the mind is doing to me. When I look outside and I notice it's raining, and then I say to myself, oh, it's raining, I pretend that I have the thought when the words happen in my mind. Oh, it's raining. Eckhart Tolle talks about how, for lots of people, when it is pointed out to them by him or by others that they have a voice in their head, that a lot of people will react with, no, I don't. Like, I don't have like talking in my head like a crazy person. And he expresses, but of course, what's responding is that voice. It's like the voice has direct access to the mouth, and so the mouth says what the voice in the head says. Now, I suspect that Eckhart Tolle is being a little overgeneral here, because I suspect that some mind designs don't use words that are heard in the head. I think a lot of them do. I suspect a lot of what we're talking about here is about the difference between the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And the left hemisphere has Broca's area, which is responsible for speech, not for understanding. That's more distributed, and actually the right hemisphere is better at understanding the meaning behind words. And if the left hemisphere doesn't work, you can do this with like injections of anesthetic into one of the arteries. because it'll tend to be specialized, and it'll create an anesthetic effect on one half of the brain. So sometimes do studies of temporarily turning off one half of the brain in order to examine how people's brains work. And in doing that, there's clearly no difficulty in understanding language. But the left hemisphere is necessary for producing language. So watching this, and I think what's going on is that there's this kind of argument. I can't quite tell exactly where the drive for the argument is coming from. I haven't quite nailed that down yet. I'm getting there. But there's this implicit argument that the actual, like the reality is the left hemisphere's reality, the modeled reality, not just verbal. Like that isn't all the left hemisphere does. The verbalization is one of the last steps. But it's the way in which I look out in the world and then I see that it's raining. And then this model boots up about the water cycle and how I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and in the Pacific Northwest it rains a lot. And why does it rain a lot? Because of these weather patterns. And I'll get these images and these partially embodied impressions of how the water cycle works for evaporating the water, and the water moves in clouds and then dumps because of changes in temperature, and etc. I don't experience all of that. I look out my window and I see that it's raining. That's true. The rest of it is a model. But if I live in the model, then there's a way where the world that I live within makes sense. And I live in some sense, what feels like a larger world. It doesn't actually. If I stop living in these models, the world that I'm actually in is much, much, much larger than these representations can hold. Sort of like I have never played a computer game that is as big as the universe. But it can feel pretty vast because I can get used to something like the Super Mario, like the old NES game, or Mario 3 or whatever, and you like running around in these worlds, and some of these worlds are really big, but they're still side-scroller worlds, and they're very small. When I stop living in those worlds and I get up from the computer game and I look around, this is vast. Not just in terms of detail, but how big is the Pacific Ocean? Often my representation doesn't actually hold anything that even begins to give me a visceral sense of how big it is. I get some hint of it when I am standing at the beach, especially if I'm at some kind of high place on the beach and I can see far. And all I see is vast water. I get some hint of it, but there I can't distinguish between the Atlantic and the Pacific. My mind brings in something more. So there's this kind of living in a small world, that this argument of, oh, I don't think the thought that it's raining until it's verbalized. One thing that does is it lets me pretend that the simulation is the real thing. Why would I want to do that? I don't know. My mind has guesses. It's related to the fact that in a simulation, everything makes sense, and everything is, in some important sense, under my control. And even when I model things as out of my control, they're out of my control in very finite, predictable ways. I can't control the water cycle, but I can understand it. But I can't understand this. I can't even understand this. All I can understand is the representation. What is this? I don't even know how to ask the question in a way that could approach what understanding would be without the model. And it's the model I'm understanding, not this. So this has put me in this really beautiful and strange space where I get scared that I'm going to get bored. I mean, last night, I guess I could say I meditated for about half an hour. That wasn't my intention at all. But basically put myself to the task of, for about the hour before I go to bed, I want to do things that aren't linguistic. I can do whatever I want, but I want to get ready for bed, and I want to do things that aren't linguistic. Set aside the representation and just be in reality. My mind very quickly booted up and started pointing out, but that means there isn't very much to do at all. Am I just going to sit there? That's going to be boring. There are all kinds of things I could do on the computer. Or maybe I could read something. I could read. But that's linguistic. What if I'm not looking at language? What if I'm looking at the non-linguistic world? Oh, hi Toby. Toby Sad says, yes, hooray for non-linguistics before bed, game changer for me. Yeah, it might end up being a game changer for me too. Well, I'll find out. There's been this, like yesterday, like 2 nights ago, I got 9 hours of sleep. And then in the late morning, after I went on my walk listening to Eckhart Tolle, and came back, tried to have a conversation with my girlfriend, and we had to end early because I had to get a nap. And then I slept for 2 hours. I didn't feel tired before, but apparently I needed another 2-hour nap. And then last night I fell asleep early, and I slept for another 9 hours. I haven't been particularly sleep deprived as far as I can tell, but it feels like, oh, my body is getting this feeling like I'm actually getting rest. So this morning I had a similar experience. There was a sense of, okay, popped up, and I noticed my mind wanting to rev into, what are some symbolic things I can do? What can I do on social media? What can I read? What can I, and I noticed, well, what if there were no internet, and if there were no books, what would I do? I noticed it was hard for me to think about that. I mean, it was very easy for me to notice, oh, I have a guitar. I haven't played the guitar in quite a while. There's something real about that. There's something real about martial skill. I've done a lot of martial arts, and there's something real about engaging with that. Like, those were like the examples that were easy to come to mind. There's a sense of, oh, I seem to have this urgency of entering the symbolic world, of entering the representation of reality, and then operating in that in order to do things. What if I don't do that? And there's fear. There's a kind of fear that arises. But the fear is in contact with reality and notices there isn't anything to be scared of. There's just this thought from a mental model that I might be abandoning the powers of my mind. But I can see that's not true. I'm just stepping outside of my mind's framework in order to decide what my mind is for. Though entertainingly, my mind does have a place to put that thought. It's helping to point out ways in which my own mind has been shattered about its own self-model. And I don't mean like I'm a victim of something. I mean, that's what a mind is. A mind, the left hemisphere of the brain is amazing at taking things out of context and examining them in detail. That's in some sense what the left hemisphere is for, taking things out of context, examining them in detail. And then the right hemisphere is what offers the context that the left can pull things out of. and reintegrates the examined model back into an embodied reality. And there's a way where I can feel this addictive pull to not bothering with that last step. Yeah, so just being present to that has been very alive for me. And I think it's part of why I've been sleeping so much. I can actually feel the energy I pour into maintaining a sort of attentional grasp on the mind's models. When I'm not doing that, I think my body's recovering, maybe just a little bit. It should be a relief. I've had difficulty with my energy levels for about 20 years. It would be nice if it turns out that the problem is basically that I've been trying to pour my body's energies into my mind, and my mind has been trying to re-stimulate my body, keep the sympathetic nervous system activity up, in order to maintain an attentional fixation on the mind. Or maybe not that particular model, but something like it. Maybe rooting in reality is rejuvenating. That would be really pleasant. I guess I'll see. Yeah, I feel complete. Thank you for watching. Thanks for Toby for stepping in.